us. Left Bank Books welcomes the acclaimed author of Spoonbenders, Daryl Gregory, who will discuss his new book, Revelator. Gregory will be in conversation with Hugo Award winner and best-selling author Sarah Gailey, and Left Bank Books resident science fiction author, me, Mark Tiedemann. Left Bank Books is St. Louis's oldest independent bookstore. Left Bank Books would like to thank all of our supporters, the supporters of Daryl and Sarah, and everyone for their outpouring of love for our bookstore. Left Bank Books offers curbside pickup and delivery to anywhere in the country. You can even walk into our store now and find this book on our beautiful displays at the front of the store. We're happy to be able to bring our events series virtual. We believe that events are a way to expand your mind and bring in new thoughts to make the world a better place. We hope you enjoy this event, and we hope you support Left Bank Books by purchasing a copy for you all and all of your friends at leftbank.com. That's left-bank.com. Purchasing a copy of the book from Left Bank Books allows us to keep our bookstore and staff operating, and thank you for your support. I am Mark Tiedemann, author and, as I said, resident science fiction expert at Left Bank Books. I help produce our hundreds of author events each year with a fantastic team here in St. Louis. We will be taking questions from the audience at the end of the event, so please type your questions as a comment. Be sure to follow Left Bank Books on Facebook and YouTube to be notified of all of our virtual events. Our fall calendar is packed with fantastic events for readers of all ages and interests. Now, about Daryl Gregory's Revelator. The dark, gripping tale of a 1930s family in the remote hills of the Smoky Mountains and their secret religion, and the daughter who turns her back on their mysterious god, from the acclaimed author of Spoonbenders. It's 1933, and 9-year-old Stella is left in the care of her grandmother, Maudie, in the backwoods of Tennessee. The mountains are home to dangerous secrets, and soon after she arrives, Stella wanders into a dark cavern where she encounters the family's personal god, an entity known as the Ghost Daddy. Years later, after a tragic incident that caused her to flee, Stella, now a professional bootlegger, returns for Maudie's funeral and to check on the mysterious 10-year-old girl named Sunny that Maudie adopted. Sunny appears innocent enough, but she is more powerful than Stella could imagine, and she's a direct link to Stella's buried past and her family's destructive faith. It's haunting and wholly engrossing, summoning mesmerizing voices and giving shape to the dark. It's Southern Gothic for all ages. Well, not all ages. Gods and Moonshine in the Great Depression, written with a tenderness and brutality only Daryl Gregory could have done. This is as good as novels get, says Stephen Graham Jones, author of The Only Good Indians. And Revelator is a brilliant, dark examination of glorious horror and horrific glory. A monstrous, hypnotic tale of worship, devotion, and family secrets. I'll be thinking about this one for a long while, says Sarah Gailey, who will be joining Daryl in conversation. So, Daryl Gregory is the author of Spoonbenders, Afterparty, The Devil's Alphabet, and other novels, and his novella We Are All Completely Fine won the World Fantasy Award and the Shirley Jackson Award. Hugo Award winner and best-selling author Sarah Gailey is an internationally published writer of fiction and nonfiction. Their nonfiction has been published by Mashable and the Boston Globe. Their short fiction credits include Vice and The Atlantic. Their debut novella, River of Teeth, was a 2018 Hugo and Nebula Award finalist. Their best-selling adult novel, Magic for Liars, was published in 2019. Their most recent novel, The Echo Wife, is available now. You can find links to their work at sarahgailey.com and on social media at @GaileyFree. That's GaileyFrey. And now I would like to welcome our guests for the evening, Daryl Gregory.
Bam!
Bam! And Sarah, welcome to Left Bank Books.
Also bam.
Mark, Sarah, thank you so much. Mark and Left Bank Books, a really fantastic bookstore. As a Midwesterner, I love that store. I love just walking around there. It's huge and beautiful. And hopefully after COVID, I get to come back. I thought I was done, and then Delta variant pulled us back in.
Yeah, imagine getting to leave the house. How exciting would that be?
Oh my God.
Well, we're almost back up to normal. It no longer looks like a warehouse. It looks like an actual store now.
Ooh.
So we are full service once more. Wear a mask. But other than that, come in and buy books if you're in town, or just come in and gawk.
Right. I mean, I think Sarah knows this. I mean, we owe so much to independent bookstores because you guys will hand sell books. You curate your collections. There's a lot of places where if you walk into a brick and mortar store where they have 3 things on the shelf and they're willing to order stuff, but there's nobody seems like there's actually watching the collection. So, I mean, and so people like Mark who actually know science fiction and are looking at those shelves, that's like golden for a writer. So,
oh yeah. It's my favorite thing in the whole world. It just lights up my whole heart.
Yeah. We've got a nice, I've been working there for almost 10 years. And
wow.
It's just been an amazing place to be. Everybody, I've never met anybody that worked there that wasn't just a wonderful human being. So,
well, book people, aren't in it, for the huge bucks. They're in it for the love. So,
oh, I don't know. I got into this line of work for the cash and the babes. I don't know about you. Easy money.
Easy.
So, let me see. I'm supposed to do. Copies are available. Sale at Left Bank Books. Do that. And,
copies available. Yes.
And the brand Upper Minimal block something else on there. Now, down to the serious stuff. The advertising for the time being is over. I have been reading both of your books. Revelator, of course, I've read almost everything Daryl has written, almost, with the exception of his one.
Should we explain that?
Well, go ahead if you think there's an explanation for it.
Well, just so you know, so Mark and I have known each other since we went to Clarion together many, many years ago. So we've each read all of our books over the years, So Sarah's sort of stepping into like this old guy trifecta where like 2 old friends have read each other's stuff for years. But also, I mean, and if there's people out there thinking about going to Clarion or Viable Paradise or those workshops, I mean, the most valuable thing you can get from them really is not really the teachers. It's if you can find your people and if you can find readers for your stuff that over the years will keep reading drafts for you and keep having these conversations and you have a group coming up with, it's a beautiful thing. It's lovely.
That's the thing that I always tell young writers who are saying, what advice do you have? It's not, here's how you get published or here's how you get an agent, but it's find peer support. Having a strong peer support network is everything.
You really need somebody to cry with. Who won't think you're weird.
Or who will think you're weird, but will say, okay, you can cry on me, weirdo.
Yeah, well, I tell people that, writers should get to know other writers because that way you don't feel like such a solitary loser, but a member of a losing team.
We're all Cubs, right?
We're all Cubs.
You want to commiserate. That's what you want.
Yeah. So I am new to Sarah Gailey's work. I'm reading Echo Wife, and let me say the prose are first rate.
Oh, thank you.
It reads like you've been doing this for a while.
Absolutely.
So what I would like to know right off the bat, how do you know each other, and what brought you to this kind of weird stuff?
It's so funny. Daryl and I were actually born in the same hospital on the same day at the same time. And then our parents took the wrong one home. And then 15 years later, we met at summer camp and we're like, oh my gosh, I think that actually we got swapped at birth.
Right. And then we did like a Parent Trap thing where we got our folks back together by impersonating each other.
Yeah. And it was flawless. They couldn't tell the difference. I sometimes still can't.
I was going to say the resemblance is striking.
Yeah, it's uncanny. It's uncanny. Yeah. People call me Daryl on the street all the time.
Here's the thing. Sarah and I sort of were like, we've been in a lot of the same places through cons over the years. But I really don't know how you got a hold of my book. All of a sudden, Seth Fishman, my agent, said, Sarah likes it. And I was like, whoa. So I don't know how that happened, but I'm so grateful. Because when you're coming out with a book, especially because I keep switching genres, it's not a really great marketing. It's not a good brand statement to keep switching genres every time you change books. But you're so grateful when you find somebody who reads the book and likes it and is willing to put their name on there. And so Sarah really helped me out and did a beautiful blurb for the book. And so thank you, Sarah. I haven't seen anybody in person, but I haven't been able to meet you in person at all. So thank you so much for that. And I still don't know how you got the book. Did I send it to you? How did this happen?
Yeah. So, first of all, absolutely my pleasure. I love yelling about books that are wonderful. And this one is truly brilliant. I'll go into it more later, but it hits all my buttons. But I know Seth. We live in the same area and we chat sometimes. And if I recall correctly, Seth picked up Revelator and went, Sarah Gailey's a huge weirdo. They'll probably like this, and emailed it to me, which Seth doesn't often do. Seth doesn't send me very many books in a cold email. But I read the description and I was like, oh, Seth sent this to me because this is exactly the same kind of weird that I am. And I think I read it in a day. I sat down in the morning. I have a morning reading time where I sit down for an hour to read because that's, part of our job. Right. And then I just didn't get up again until the book was over. I could not escape it.
Well, that's tremendous. And like I said, when I was reading Echo Wife and then I went back and reread and then to get ready for this thing, and I was like, wow, there's a lot of parallels and stuff we could talk about. From my end, obviously I'm a guy, but I grew up in this Baptist church in this very kind of restrictive environment. And the women in the church weren't allowed to vote. My mom wasn't allowed to vote even when they were voting on things like what kitchen equipment should the church have. They were not allowed to do that, the kind of thing. And so I was just aware coming out of the environment I came out of, how much there was all this kind of shaping of women and sort of taking their stories away and sort of making it part of the church story. And when I was writing the book, and I had this great conversation one time at a bar with another writer, and she said, women, we tell our stories. We have an oral tradition where we are talking to each other outside of the normal channels. And I realized, I was in the middle of rewriting the book. I'm like, well, that's the key to the book, really. It's like they have their own story that's being taken away from them by these guys who are trying to run the church and control what the story is. And that helped me tremendously in writing the next draft of the story. And Echo Wife is all about control, shaping, literal programming of women and trying to control their lives and their stories. So I was thrilled we got a chance to have this conversation.
I have been so amped to talk to you both about religion and about gender and the way that you write about this in Revelator. I reread the book 2 days ago now, just to be fresh for this event. And reading it, knowing what happens is a complete trip because you do such a great job of laying out breadcrumbs to get to the final conclusion. It feels inevitable by the time you get there. But also, as I was reading it, I was fascinated by this sense of a kind of religious grooming that can happen with kids who are growing up in a certain kind of religious environment where there's a lot of groundwork laid to say, our religion isn't oppressive the same way that other one is. Here's all the freedoms that you get that they don't get. And that's why our religion is a good one. I was totally fascinated by the kind of contrast between Stella, the protagonist's visits to a local primitive Baptist church, and her own family religion, and the way that she feels like she has all these freedoms until she realizes that she doesn't.
Right. Well, so this novel takes place in the 30s and 40s in Cage Cove, Tennessee, which is now part of the Smoky Mountain National Park. My people came out of Cage Cove. Both sides of the family were kicked out of Cage Cove when they made it a national park. And they basically eminent domained everybody out of there. And so my whole family came out of there. But you can go back and see the churches and the cemeteries where my people are buried. And the Primitive Baptist Church is there. So a friend of mine who read this said, Daryl, that's a little too on the nose. You can't call it the Primitive Baptist Church. I'm like, no, that's the literal name of the church. They thought they were the pure church. So primitive meaning like primitive abstract, like primitive geometric shapes, like you can make everything out of a triangle or a square. So it was a real church. It's still standing there. You can still go visit there. And I was struck by the fact of like, I wanted Stella, my hero, to be able to say things that I was too scared to say coming up in the church, and point out some things saying, wait a minute, there's a lot of these things in the religion that don't make sense to me because she's coming from outside religion. Things like, well, wait a minute. So God gave his son, Jesus Christ, and he died to save the world. For God so loved the world, he gave his only begotten son. This is how you know I was raised Baptist. I could start quoting scripture. And Stella's question is, wait a minute. So God is sacrificing his own son to himself? Like, so when you're inside the religion, those questions don't occur to you. But when you're outside of it, it's like, wait, this is freaky. And so I wanted to point out that, yes, you can sort of point at Stella's family worshiping this weird god called the Ghost Daddy and say that, well, obviously they're deranged, but the own religion that they're inside the Cove is also deeply strange when you start breaking down some of the stories. And the Abraham and Isaac story, it's crazy.
I love the theme of sacrifice that you weave throughout this entire book. I was reading this and I was like, oh, so we grew up in a Protestant church, did we? The theme of nobility and sacrifice as being kind of, at times, silly and overrated, and also at times deeply profound and beautiful, really reads to me as an incredible exploration of exactly that thing of like, religion's weird, huh?
It's so weird. I don't know how you grew up or if you grew up in a church, but there is this weird thing where when you're inside of the bubble, it's so lovely. You feel protected. There's people watching out for you. And you're also right. You're right about the world. You're right. You know you're right. So I was struck by that. And like growing up in the church, they made a mistake. My parents made a mistake in letting me read a lot of science fiction.
Oh, that's how they lose you.
They lose you right away. I mean,
you're like, did God make the Enterprise?
It wasn't heavy metal. It was Heinlein, and it was science fiction, because the lesson of science fiction is that it could be different. Everything you think could be different if you just think outside of your own box.
Yeah.
But the lesson of the church is this is the only way it can be. This is the one true way it has to be. And so that cognitive dissonance always messed with me all through my teens, until I finally got to the point where it's like, I got to leave the church because I don't think this is adding up for me.
Yeah.
I truly love the way that you contrast in Revelator that certainty that's based on faith versus the certainty that's based on something totally concrete, right? Ghost Daddy is literally a god that you can touch, and that he can touch you back in ways that are going to keep me up at night if I think too hard about him. And the contrast between that and going to this Baptist church and being like, well, this guy's just telling me about God, but like, where does that God live? Can I go vibe with him sometime?
Right.
It's incredible to read, especially through the eyes of a child.
Right. Well, that was the root of the story. That's where the first idea came from. And it came from I had this idea for a short story a long time ago thinking, well, what if your God was actually real and you could physically touch them? And so it's not a matter of faith in that believing that they're true. They're literally there in front of you. So then the only question of faith is, do you follow or do you not follow? So that was the root of the story, because I thought, how undeniable would that be if Jesus was physically there and could touch you and you could hang out, like vibe with Jesus. That was the whole start of the story. And then from there it was like, well, and like you pointed out earlier, Sarah, is like, what kind of grooming happens and shaping of people happens with these structures that get set up? The God has its own agenda in the novel, but also all the people surrounding the God have their own agendas. The older women have their own agendas. It's a whole structure that you get sucked into.
That's such an interesting origin point for this story, because it's just really coming together for me now how much this story is about the way that we can grow up and come out of a faith tradition as a result of growing up and getting that perspective on the agendas of the people around us. It's like children can grow up inside of a faith tradition, and then they grow up and realize that, for instance, the pastor who's been telling them how to live doesn't live the way that he tells them to. And so they go, well, I should ask questions. And I love how you've taken that and turned it into some of the most horrifying prose I've ever read in my life.
I apologize. Yeah.
No,
You should.
heads up, 'cause like I said, I haven't finished it yet, and I normally stay as far away from horror fiction as I can get, but it's Daryl, so I'm going to read it.
Yeah, you're in trouble.
I'm in trouble.
I don't know, Sarah, if this is like this for you, but when you're doing multiple drafts, do you lose track of what the truly horrifying part is as you're grooming the sentences and you're making everything work and you're shaping the story? One problem I have is sometimes I lose track. It stops being as horrifying to me because I'm just trying to make the scene work. I'm trying to see it clearly enough. And then it's only later, like sometimes months later after it comes out, after you've finished working on it, a year ago, that you're like, oh, I guess that is kind of horrifying. I sort of forgot.
Yeah, because you rationalize it in the process of putting it into prose. And once you've rationalized it, it sort of saps the venom.
Well, yeah, and you stop seeing it from out here, and you're sort of zooming in. You're trying to get, what does it feel like Sarah's Echo Wife? God, it's so horrifying, and because you have a main character who also cannot see how horrifying it is, but the author knows, and the reader is seeing it. You're like, and the casualness in which they are dumping bodies and killing off clone bodies, and like you're like, oh my God, it's horrifying. But the sentences are so cleanly wrought that you're following along, and you're sort of deeply inside Evelyn's head in this novel. So you're just so people know, Evelyn's like a brilliant geneticist a groundbreaking person who came up with this cloning method. It's used by a lot of different. It's a commercial, private sort of venture where people can use clones to, I think you described catching bullets, using them for organ harvesting. I mean, terrible, terrible things. And she's like, yep, that's the business. That's what we do. You're like, oh my God. And her mindset is the truly scary part about the book. It's not what's happening to the bodies. It's the fact it's her response to it that keeps catching you back. At least that's what it did for me.
Yeah.
Nicely done.
Thank you. I totally do lose track of what the horrifying thing is. To answer your original question, I do this thing where I'll write the first draft. I write a linear book. I start at the beginning of the book, and then I write the whole stinky thing, and then I go back and I say, okay, how broken is this? And the answer is always very. And I write, like the goopy stuff on that first pass. I write like, oh, their eyeball popped out. When I go back through, I'm like, their eyeball popped out, and it reminded them of deep-seated trauma. And that to me becomes the horrifying thing. So then, 85 drafts later, a reader will be like, wow, when the eyeball popped out, that was really something. And I'm like, well, that's right. That eyeball did pop out. I was just thinking about the trauma.
Yeah.
Meanwhile, you've traumatized them and you've totally moved on. Yeah,
yeah, exactly. Speaking of trauma,
I'm going to have fun.
Revelator.
Wow. Well, one of the jokes that Daryl and I have is that I have read everything he has published except Raising Stony Mayhall, because I absolutely, completely I don't just loathe zombie fiction. I am so bored with zombie fiction. I'm like, please, the steampunk was ruined, in my opinion, because they kept putting zombies in there. And I told him that. He goes, but Mark, I wrote that for you. It's not a horrific zombie thing. It gets better.
It's an anti-zombie novel.
It's a zombie novel. And I'm like, okay, now I'm ashamed of
He's
myself.
a nice zombie. He's the most politest boy from Iowa you could ever meet. Sure, he's dead, and he wants to bite people every once in a while, but he's a nice
Nobody's
guy.
perfect.
Nobody's perfect. Yeah.
So,
Listen, I'm also dead and want to bite people every once in a while.
I've reached in my life that when I'm dead, I'm too tired to bite anybody.
Right. Oh, yeah.
Yeah,
So,
that's true.
Why? Okay, there's a couple of answers to this which I've probably already figured out, but I'm going to go ahead and ask it. Why start in the 30s?
Yeah. Here's why. So, like I said, my folks came out of Cades Cove, and I was really interested in that period of time when they were kicking all these families out and to make this national park. And it was sort of an end of an era. And it seemed to be a good place dramatically because now, how are you going to hide your god, your monster who's hiding in a cave, if they're part of a national park? Like, do they become a tourist attraction? Like, what happens? I mean, even the bears get heavily photographed in Cades Cove. So I was really interested in that period of time when it was over with, but also because they were preserving the park, and I can go back and visit Cades Cove and see all the see the gravestones where my folks are buried, my ancestors rather. I've been going there my entire life, so I wanted to write about that area, and I wanted to write about it before all the people left, and it became sort of a Disney version of that valley. So that said, okay, so that told me it had to be in the 30s. But I also have this habit of writing stories in which the big stories already happened and somebody's coming back into town after the stories happen. And so that's the second half of the story. Stella, the story doesn't work for me unless Stella has to come back. She can't just leave and run away. She has to settle the score, and she has to she has to basically end the cycle of abuse that's been happening through generations of these women. And she can't let it happen again, even though she's been trying to ignore it and deny it and go on with her life. She has to come back. So I thought, okay, so that's the second part of the story. And the hard structural thing as a writer, you guys know this, is that then you got to figure out, well, what's your path through the story? Because there's a big cloud of story, right? There's all different ways you could tell it. And you have to figure out what is the structure and the way to tell it that's actually going to work. Starting from like third person or first person, or is it all happened in the current day and it's all flat, and then you do a lot of flashbacks. And so for me, it was a process that I didn't trust for a long time of alternating chapters between young Stella and old Stella. And I was halfway through the book and I sang to my editor saying, is this working? Should I bail out right now? And he's like, keep going. And I like the alternating chapters because the tricky part is to make the tension keep going, where you get the early story and the later story back and forth. And that was the toughest part of the book, is following through on the structure.
It is such a hard structure. It's also hard because you can't have your kind of more present day character reveal all the stuff you're trying to have unfold that happened in their past that is like the future for the past version of them. It's a living nightmare.
It is a nightmare. And because, you want to play fair with the reader. So one reason I realized it had to be third person is because I had to dip into her head and get back out of there, because you don't want to have her just think all the things that happen. And and you do this really graceful thing in Echo Wife. It's the same thing where Evelyn knows a lot of information, but it's only gradually revealed. She sort of doles it out. And what I like about the way you did in that book is the reason why she's doling it out, or why she thinks of things certain times, is because she's deliberately not thinking about a lot of stuff. She's keeping it buried, and then it comes out in her anger or she's finally forced, especially at the end, she's forced to deal with stuff from her childhood. It just sort of, the situation of the story is forcing her to go back and dredge this stuff up. And that's another really graceful way. Like, you got to figure out, how do you keep tension and keep the story when, your main character knows all this stuff and could tell you everything. They could info dump it in the first 5 pages, say, look, here's everything you need to know. Here's all the stuff, and then we'll be done here. All right? Are we done? Are we good?
Just a little Shakespearean introduction, like, here's what's going to happen in the rest of this book.
Yes. Yeah. The choir of, well, no, but it also, it's very organic, because somebody in her position wouldn't be thinking about all this stuff all the time. I mean, she's already done that. That's in the past. So you just keep moving forward. And only when a new problem crops up does she have to reflect on, oh, where'd that come from? Oh, yeah.
Well, and Marcella was drinking heavily a lot through the book. There's a lot of moonshine in this book.
I was going to point that out. What does she do to forget? She becomes a bootlegger. Yeah.
Well, I got to give a shout out. Okay,
I'm sorry to interrupt. I was just going to say that I want to know all about the bootlegging. I love crime, I love science, and I love booze. So you brought all those together in this huge, beautiful bootlegging leg of the plot that's very prominent and well described and fascinating. And I want to know more.
Okay, I have to give a shout out to my Uncle Clinton. Well, okay, so first of all, you should know,
of course,
out of Cade's Cove, my dad used to say they're preaching Gregories and they're whiskey Gregories, and probably some of them overlapped. So my people did some moonshining. You could go to Gregory Cave in Cade's Cove, where supposedly we had a still. You could climb Gregory Bald, where my great times 5 grandfather was one of the founders of Cade Cove and lived up there. And corn whiskey is just part of the culture. And my Uncle Clinton was moonshining until the very recent past, I believe. And so I went and sat down with him one afternoon and said, just tell me all the stories, tell me your recipe, tell me everything. And so he was a moonshiner. And so his recipe for moonshine is in the book. His still setup is in the book. A lot of and also Abby, the character who's the main moonshiner and the taxidermist, is based on, basically my Uncle Clinton, who gave me this raccoon when I was 10 years old, shot it, stuffed it, gave it to me. It's been following me from house to house ever since then. And his house is a wonder. It's full of bears, huge boars, Russian boars that are in the Tennessee woods. That's another whole story of how did the Russian boars end up there?
And what's their hurry?
Snakes, it's crazy. And his house is amazing. And so because of my Uncle Clinton, that's why there's so much weird taxidermy in that book as well. But I wanted, there's this thing, I don't know, Sarah and Mark, if you guys do this, so you stumble into a plot element that you think, I'm going to add moonshine. That'll give Stella something as a job to do later. I like all the details of moonshining. But then you start trying to look for, how can I use this thematically? How can I use this stuff? And for me, it was, this process of distillation, of taking a lot of toxic things and burning it down to something pure, was a metaphor that kept coming up and I could keep reusing. And once you get alert to that stuff, you hold on to that thing because it makes people think what you did was on purpose.
Yep. Yeah, I have never done a thing on purpose in a book in my life, and I don't know how to start, but that is always how it happens. I'll be like, oh, this seems neat. And then my beloved editor, Miriam Weinberg, will be like, oh, why is it necessary to the plot? And I'll be like, oh, themes. It's all about the themes. It's part of the motifs. There's a lot of syllogisms in it.
You just keep throwing words at him until he gets...
All right. Yeah.
I also thought that the taxidermy was really beautifully thematic because, and I don't think this is giving anything away, it's part of the liturgy of the faith, is this notion of pursuing some manner of immortality. The first ever religion to be trying to figure out eternal life. And I think that taxidermy in many ways parallels the kind of hollow eternal life that people seek through certain avenues of faith, not all avenues of faith, but certain avenues of faith where they're looking to live forever. And
Oh man, Sarah, I wish I had thought of this when I was writing it, because now I'm totally going to tell people that's what I meant.
Oh yeah, take that one for free.
Oh.
Also, I just want to say for any revenuers who might be listening, I loved hearing about your uncle who stopped moonshining 1 year before the statute of limitations on moonshining and on pursuing any kind of legal action regarding that.
He's totally not illegal at this moment.
Yeah, I think that's just so cool. That now you can talk about it without opening him up to indictment because it's been precisely the correct number of years.
I'm sorry, Mark. I don't know where you were going with this conversation, but we're having fun.
It's marvelous. It's marvelous. I was going to add that not to plug somebody else's book, but there's a mystery series by a writer named Margaret Maron called The Bootleggers' Daughter, which is the first volume. And literally it's about a woman whose father was a bootlegger. She starts off as a lawyer and then becomes a judge. And dad is retired. And the whole series has little bits about the bootlegging life in there. And it was very amusing. And I thought, okay, this could be a lot of fun.
Well, I did write an essay. It's going up on Crime Reads about the moonshining part. And I do say it's like, for a man who's retired, my uncle sure had a lot of moonshine fresh around the house when I visited. So,
well, it keeps.
it's a good storage mechanism
for purposes. So the cloning, briefly, I'd like to touch on the cloning aspect. What attracted you to that as something to explore?
Sarah? Gosh. Well, I mean, when I was writing The Echo Wife, I knew that I really wanted to go into the question of what makes a person the person who they are. It's something that is like the thing that I think about most of the time, when I should be thinking about why things thematically are important to my writing, so that I have an actual excuse to my editor. And I wanted to dive into that. I wanted to dive into the things that shape us, the things that we acknowledge shape us, the things that we don't acknowledge shape us. I think that a lot of people in Western cultures, especially the United States, have this kind of autobiographical myth of self-determination. Right? I love to tell myself that I decide why I am the way I am. I make decisions consciously about who I'm going to be, when really a lot of those decisions were made by my genetics. A lot of those decisions were made by people who harmed my ancestors, just changing their DNA. A lot of those decisions were made by my parents and my family and yada, yada. And I don't think there's a better way to do that than with clones, because if you have a clone of yourself, it's pure genetic material with the method that Evelyn Caldwell uses. I've got a Daryl Gregory in front of me, and then I go science, and I've got another one in a tube full of goop right next door. And I can pull the one out of the tube full of goop and say, okay, what are you like compared to this Daryl? What shapes this Daryl to make this Daryl the way he is versus the way that you are? And then we get to ask all those horrible questions of which one's better. Am I better because of the way I've chosen to be, or am I worse? And who tells me which one is better or worse, and do I choose to believe them or not? This is it's a fun, lighthearted book. It's a rock.
And who's morally? One other question I liked was, and who's morally responsible for someone who is very similar to you, but is not exactly you in this instant? Like Nathan, is this new? If there's a clone of a person, are they at all morally responsible for someone they shared 99.999% of their genetic material and thought processes to? Can you hold them responsible, or are they a whole new individual?
Well, and if you are questioning who's human and who's not, right? That's always the eternal question, like, are clones human or androids human? Then what moral accountability do we expect of them? I don't expect the same level of moral accountability from my partner as I do from my dog. So if a clone's not a person, and a clone, for instance, murders somebody, are they morally responsible? Or is the person who created them morally responsible? Or is the person who they call for help morally responsible?
Yeah, you did a crappy job of decanting. We're calling you up on charges. Okay, just to let everybody know who is watching, if you have a question, go over into the comments section and post your question, and I will read it aloud. We did have a comment a while back, and I wanted to share that before we leave, from David O'Neill. He says, I accidentally discovered Spoonbenders by Daryl Gregory, buying this book at Vroman's in Pasadena, originally from the burbs of Chicago, so I love reading this book and nodding my head at all the locations he has characters visit. Then I went on to read his other stuff, and I fell in love more. Still have a few more books to go, though, but I am catching up.
Get on it.
Get on it, Dave. Jesus, you're waiting. No, thank you, David. That's very nice. One of the nice things about writing about a place you grew up in, I grew up in Chicago, is you get to put in as many references and in-jokes as possible. And one of my favorite moments, anytime I bring somebody with me to Chicago, I introduce them to this sandwich called the combo, which is you take an Italian sausage and you put it in a bun, then you pile Italian beef on top of it. Because in Chicago, meat is a condiment. It's the only town where it's like, you know what would be good with meat? More meat on top. Different meat. God, I love Chicago.
Yeah. I haven't kept track of how many stories or books you've set there.
I tend to, Chicago tends to show up, not many set right there, but usually someone's coming from Chicago into Tennessee or over to Iowa or, yeah. And then Stella and her dad show up from Chicago in the first chapter. Yeah. And that's my experience as an outsider insider, which is all my parents grew up in Tennessee. All my cousins are there. We were there all the time. But I grew up in Chicago, so the South for me is kind of like this. It's my culture, but I'm one step out of it, sort of watching it, which I think lets me write about it in a different way than maybe if I was totally inside of it. Yeah, it's a weird thing.
Yeah, you're not doing a William Faulkner so much as an Ernest Hemingway.
There you go. Yeah, I'm going to watch the bullfights. I'm not in the bull. Yeah, I wasn't raised with them.
And you don't keep going back home to Yakima to that place. I was able to pronounce that at one time in my life. I've never thought I would set stories in St. Louis, and I've written 5 books that are in St. Louis locations now.
Well, I don't know, Sarah. What's it like for you? Is there a time delay for places you've lived that you wait until you can write about them, or is it?
Oh gosh, I mean, my first novel, Magic for Liars, is set in the Bay Area, which is where I was born and raised. But I set it outside of cities where I lived, kind of on purpose, because I don't know. I feel strange writing about places that I've lived because it feels so. Nope, can't think of a better phrase than this. Close to home. I feel like my personal experience of a place that I've lived is so narrow because it's so based on the places that I have access to, the cultures that I'm immersed in. So I really prefer to write about places that I've visited. Also because I am extraordinarily lazy with my descriptions of settings. And so I can, in that way, get away with some more broad strokes than having to really dial it in. Oakland is kind of the home of my heart. And it's constantly changing. Gentrification is really ripping up the floorboards more and more every day. And so it's also a little heartbreaking to me to describe places that I'm from. It feels so time locked and specific to a time before what's happening now started to happen.
Right. No, I love Oakland. I lived there for a few years, and I just recently had to write a science fiction story for an anthology that'll be out in a while, but it was barely science fiction. And then I'm writing about the smoke rolling in, and all my friends right now are, the smoke is rolling through the Bay Area from all these forest fires. And it is a town sort of on the edge. There's all that money rolling across from San Francisco, and it's changing the environment. And I'm not a native there, so I can't imagine what it feels like to see all this stuff changing pretty quickly.
It's so strange. I had to go back and visit recently to help deal with a family medical emergency that was going on in the Bay. And just driving through, I was like, oh, it's all, even from the last time I was there, which was about 2 years ago, it's all different. It's all different, which I really loved that sense in Revelator of like, oh, everything is changing, everything is being taken away that you love about this place. You know, they're turning it into a national park. Who does this benefit? Not me or the people who I know who lived here.
Right.
Yeah. So David O'Neill replied. He says, "I'm working on it, sir. I've got the new
Okay, good. All right, good. Good to hear it, Dave.
and awaiting another Harrison Square."
Oh, yeah, so am I. Yeah, there's one Harrison Squared book, and I made the mistake of declaring this is a trilogy, and then it just never happened. At some point, through Hell or High Water, I'll finish that series, and it's tied into. There's an adult Harrison who's tied into this book called "We Are All Completely Fine," and so hopefully, the masterwork will all. I just need to not die before I get around to finishing all these stories. So.
Well,
that is exactly how I feel every day. I've got this list of things I need to write, and I'm like, all right, hang in there, buddy.
Every time I get a book done, I think, okay, good. It's in the can. It doesn't even have to be published yet. It just has to be done with the final copy edits. I'm like, okay, good. All right, that's one down.
Now I can take one step closer to the grave.
Yeah. Right, exactly. It's like I just figured at some point a cement truck is going to take me out, and so I just want to not be in the middle of a sentence when I'm doing it.
Yeah. Well, but that leaves a mystery for everybody. Because they rob your estate, they put it out there, says, "Here's the unfinished great. What do you want to do? You'll be the next Dickens."
Oh, somebody publishing an early draft. Ooh,
right.
Oh, that's blistering. That's the nightmare.
Oh man, yeah. I write differently than Sarah in that I'm a recursive writer. So I write chapter 1, then the next time I rewrite chapter 1 and I write chapter 2, then I rewrite chapter 2 and chapter 1, and I keep. So by the time I get done with the book, I've rewritten some chapters, 20 times. And I don't recommend this process to anybody. I mean, every other writer's process sounds completely horrible, and mine sounds appalling to a lot of people because it takes forever to get somewhere. So I will have the only problem with my process, or the biggest problem with it, is I could be halfway through the book and have a lot of really polished sentences that don't belong.
Oh
so
no.
You're kind of ruthless and say, nope, the story's changed. Those got to go.
That's just the worst.
And I wish I had a different way of doing it, but I've trouble writing a really rough draft because I keep thinking, I'll look at the sentence and realize I could fix it. And then I think, what if I forget it's bad? And so I have to fix it right then because I know it's bad.
Yeah. What if by the time you finish writing the book, your brain's all evaporated and then you go back and you lose track of it?
Yeah, exactly. What if things have atrophied? What if the moonshine takes hold and I really can't lose track of all of this?
Well, there you go. You have to have a lot of mason jars then to get through the next book.
Yeah, that well-aged moonshine from the last distillation. Yeah. I had a problem like this in the book that I just turned in, where the first draft that I wrote, I got to the end of it and I wrote the last sentence, and then I went, oh my God, every character and thought and idea that is presented as bad in this book needs to be presented as good, and every thought and character and idea that's presented as good needs to be bad. I basically changed it from a pretty straight ahead horror novel to really, really screwed up romance. And so I had to go back through, and the problem with that is that I had all these beautiful sentences that were making things really evocatively grotesque. And I had to basically like gut out this is grotesque and lay in a bunch of spackle of this is sexy and cool, actually. And there were some sentences where they were really gorgeous when they were foul, but making them nice, I was like, oh, this is boring now.
I just discovered I can put the comments on the screen, so I just wanted to.
Oh, okay. Thank you, Robin Boyer.
And this one, I don't read kanji, so I don't know.
But the emojis tell us that it's friendly.
Yeah, yeah, it ends with a heart and an okay sign. So I think we're okay.
A devastating criticism of your entire body of work, followed by a heart and a peace sign.
Yeah, that's all I need is "you suck" smiley face. That would be.
I do get Twitter mentions like that sometimes.
Oh God! And there's no translation function here that I can find. So, oh gee, we've got about 10 minutes to go. And let me say, if you want to hang out after the official broadcast is over, you can hang around and we can talk privately. So,
so if people have questions, now is the time to.
Yeah. Anybody else?
Yeah. Anybody who does not work for the federal government, whatever questions you might have for us, we'll be so happy to answer.
Yeah. I'm. Just don't ask the one question. I know Sarah has a question she hates to get, and she can talk about that if she wants. The question I hate would be going out on tour, and the question would be like, "So what are you working on now?" And I'd be thinking, it's like coming out of the hospital with a new baby, and you're like, look, I have this new baby. I'm on tour, and you're like, well, that's great, but what's the next one like? Like, are you working on the next one? I'm like, can we not just appreciate the child that just came out of the hospital?
Well, it's also brutal because a lot of times if you're writing on contract, you really can't talk about what you're working on now. And then if you say, well, I can't really share, people go, ooh, is it Star Wars? And it's like, I can't.
Cloak and Dagger, secret stuff. Okay.
Well, I have the same problem. Like I was talking to Paul Tremblay last night, and like we were talking about TV stuff. And the problem with TV stuff is I could talk about it, but all of it may disappear tomorrow. Like, I think Chuck Wendig said once, it's like the difference between publishing and Hollywood is that in publishing, people say no, 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 no. And then when they say yes, your book's going to be published. And in Hollywood, they can say yes, 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 and then no, and then everything could be disappeared. So,
yeah.
The good part of that is that it means that you could tell as many tall tales about Hollywood stuff as you like, and no one will be able to tell the difference.
Well, yeah, exactly, because none of them actually, I
heard that there was option interest from Spielberg for Revelator. I heard that he came to your house with a bouquet of daffodils and said, "Please, can I make this movie?"
It was so weird, and I'd asked him to show up in a kilt, but instead it was this weird Speedo thing, and I'm like, "Look, I know you have great legs, but we had to have a conversation about it."
It sounds like he was trying to go above and beyond to woo you, which I appreciate, given the 10 other major film studios climbing the walls of your home to try and get in through the chimney and talk to you about this. But right. Steven, you got to play it soft.
You didn't tell him to be taken out?
Yeah.
They're on the roof looking for the hole.
The question that I hate is when people ask, where do you get your ideas? And they never ask it like that. They always ask like, so what made you think about a hippopotamus when you were starting to write this book? And I'm always like, first of all, the way that publishing works, you both know this, but our viewers might not, is that you write something and then about 80 years later it gets published. And you have to climb back through your memories to try and find that information. And for me, that doesn't exist. I don't store stuff up here. This is all just filler. And the other thing is that like where ideas come from is such a swamp. It's like the question of like, I don't know, why do you blink the way you do? It's like, oh, I don't know, I gotta really dive deep for that one. So you end up having to often make something up or like cobble something together that won't make you sound like a lunatic. And I always just think of, his name is lost to me right now, but a famous mystery author who took to answering that question with, there's a mail order service I signed up for, and you send $20 at the beginning of the year, and every week a little envelope shows up on your doorstep, and it has an idea in it, and that's the next book I write.
I like Stephen King's answer, which is, I have the heart of a small boy, which I keep in a jar on my desk. But no, it's true. Like when it comes time to talk about like, how did this start? And it's like, you feel like you're lying because you're generating this. You sort of feel like you're creating a story out of a bunch of bits because you're not sure exactly how it happened. One thing I'm alarmed by is it takes me a long time for the kernel of idea to actually become something. So I'm always kind of shocked when I go back through my notebooks and I realize there's an idea I've been messing with for 10 years. and like, oh, here's the start of it here. And then you lose track of it, and then it comes back, and then you lose track of it, and maybe it never becomes a story, or maybe you finally figured out how to make it. There's a critic named John Clute, and he has this phrase called, how to make something storyable. You can have an idea, you can have a premise, but how do you make it into something that is a story that draws people through it? That's not just the setup for a story, or not just a weird image, but actually something with enough depth to it, especially for novels, to write a novel about. And so I don't know if anyone ever watched Seinfeld, but there was a whole thing with Elaine. She had some of the last of the contraceptive sponges. And so with every person she dated, she was like, is this guy sponge worthy? I feel the same way with story ideas. I'm like, all right, I'm a slow writer for novels. Is this worth a novel? Like, is this the idea? Should I just date a while? Should I date the idea and see if we like each other? And then maybe we'll gradually come to an understanding and go make a novel together. I don't know.
Yeah, it's wild when people ask why you decided to write a book. It's like they're saying, why did you decide to make moonshine? And you show them a handful of corn. It's just like, does this answer your question? I don't know.
Well, one, it makes more money than just as corn. I could leave it as corn, but the other one I could sell. Yeah.
Okay.
And there is something to, and sometimes I tell this to students. I'm like, sometimes you just have to decide to write something, and then that you hold a gun to your brain's head and say, it's time to write an idea. It's time to write a story. You don't wait for the muse. You go and you say, look, I got to do this. Come up with a story. So I sometimes agree to theme anthologies where I have no freaking idea for that theme, just so it'll make me write a story about something that maybe I would never have written before.
Yeah. I used to be a really prolific short story writer. In my first year of writing, I wrote like 27 short stories. They just popped out of my ears like corn. And I could just write one at the drop of a hat. I would be like, oh, I'm in the mood to write. And I would sit down and go, what do I want to write about? Boop, 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 boop. A few hours later, short story. Now I'm old and decrepit. And I do the same thing where I'll sign up for a theme anthology. And for some reason, I still have it in my head that I can just sit down and pop out a short story. So like the day before the short story is due, I'll sit down and be like, what do I want to write about? And then I realize like, oh God, it takes so much more time now. What did I do?
Yeah. The worst thing you can do for yourself for productivity is to start caring too much. Like, it's like there's an obliviousness when you're first starting out. But I used to paint myself into corners all the time. So now I don't start until I have an ending. It doesn't have to be the ending. I may change my mind about halfway through, but I don't start now until I have an ending in mind, because too many times I've just started out with a premise and then there actually is no story there to write about.
Oh, that's the most brutal part of being an author is you come up with a premise, you come up with a little pitch, you come up with like, oh, I've got this great concept. And then you sit down and you're like, oh my God, I have to put a plot in that thing.
Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left. Have any final thoughts?
No, David asked, did you ever envision your life as a writer or going around in a van solving mysteries? Well, of course, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't want to go in a van in the mystery machine solving mysteries?
I mean, then you've got a van. That's more than I get as an author.
Yeah.
I got a van.
If anybody catches this quote, what kind of Ford van?
Daryl, did you always know that this was going to be your life?
No, I always from a very young age, like around high school, this is what I wanted my life to be. I didn't think it was actually possible because I didn't know anybody who was a writer. I didn't know. It wasn't until I actually went to Clarion that I met other writers and I met teachers who had been in the same place I was. And I thought it was possible. I thought for me, writing was like declaring yourself an alligator wrestler and you'd never met an alligator. You just heard about it and thought maybe you could do it. It's ridiculous. And so I didn't know any writers. And it wasn't until Clarion, that was really a life-changing experience for me because I thought, oh, this is not only possible, but other people have been just as bad as I am. And it became famous. I went through the archives of Michigan State University and read the early stories of some really famous people. And it was so lovely when some of them were terrible.
That's such a gift.
It really was. It was a huge gift because I thought, oh, this is a craft. It's not it's not like you wake up a genius. And I met some geniuses, but for most of us, it's like a thing that you can get better at over time, that you can keep working at your craft. And for that, I'm grateful because it always gives you a hope that you can get better and you could, and the next book can be better than the last, hopefully.
Well, I will say for everybody watching this, if you're wondering if Daryl Gregory's most recent book is better than whatever this stuff is that he's saying that he wrote badly in the past, the answer is yes. Revelator is a work of genius. I adore it. It's frightening. It's thought-provoking. It's beautifully rendered. It's loving to the place that it's set in a way that's so refreshing. And I'm so glad that I got to read it and talk about it with you.
Oh, thanks so much. And thank you for so much helping me launch this book this week. I really appreciate it. Mark, all the people at Left Bank Books, people listening, thanks so much. I mean, this has been lovely. And also, everybody go buy Echo Wife, the latest, and the book to be named later that Sarah cannot talk about right now, that is coming out next year, and Magic for Liars and everything else. Go get everything.
Buy all of them from Left Bank Books. Buy enough copies for yourself, your friends, all the ancient gods that you know and worship, all of the invisible gods that you don't necessarily get to hang out with in person, but really do trust would be interested in reading our work. Buy some for Mark, just to have. Buy early and often.
You can always buy 5 copies of a book that you want. One to loan out, one for the bathroom, one for the guest room, and one that you lose on the bus going somewhere.
That's what we call viral marketing.
There you go. So thank you all for attending, and go to left-bank.com and you can find all the things that we've been talking about and some more besides. Thank you very much, Daryl. Thank you very much, Sarah. If you want to hang out after the live portion is done, it would be great. And good night.
Good night,
Thanks,
everybody.
everybody.